All right. Your Bibles or digital devices to John 18. This is obviously going to be a little bit more of an intimate service than what we're used to. One, there are no kids present, which wasn't planned, but by divine inspiration, I think it's going to work out because the subject matter we're covering today is the crucifixion of Christ. And I'm a little bit relieved that the kids aren't here because we've always included them in our services. We've always included them in what we talk about because I think it's important that they get an unadulterated and unfiltered truth, that we don't have to dumb down the message of the Bible so the kids can understand it. That being said, the subject matter today is a little bit more gruesome, a little bit more, R-rated than what I'm comfortable with kids hearing. So that being said, for the YouTube audience, if there is one, this one is not for kids. This is a message about the brutal beating and death of Jesus. And I'm not going to cut any corners or pull any punches when we get to those parts. So there's going to be some graphic content. We're not going to over-glorify it or under-diminish what happened. We're just going to spell it out like it is, but I think it's important in order to get a proper and humble understanding of what exactly occurred on Calvary that day, that there are certain details we do have to talk about, and so we'll get into those a little bit. But ultimately, I don't want to dwell on the horror of that. I want to dwell on the awesome power that is the cross. And we started in the book of John when we launched the Fringe. And the reason I stated for that and still hold to in that is because the cross is the centerpiece of all of human history. Everything in history either points towards, as in, predicting what was going to happen at the cross, or in our case, looking back at the cross. And I think that it's important that we approach the entire rest of the Bible and everything else we do in the time that God has granted us, as a church and as a body, that we filter it through the lens of the cross. And today is no different. So the events that we're going to be talking about today, both leading up to and including the crucifixion itself, I want it to be centered on the fact that this has always been God's plan. Ever since the fall of man in the garden, when Adam and Eve chose wrong, that this is how it was supposed to happen, that this was what was going to occur. As Christ said over and over and over again to his disciples, this is the ultimate, this is why I came. I didn't come to be a healer, to be a teacher. I came to die for your sins. That was his purpose, that was his mission, and that couldn't happen without the cross. We're actually going to start, not in John 18, but I want to go back to Psalm 22. Now, this was written by David, and almost everybody's supremely familiar with Psalm 23, which is, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," etc., etc. But right before that is Psalm 22. And I want to start here because in the other Gospels they record, John only records one thing or one or two things that Christ says from the cross itself. The other Gospels go into more detail about the events of Christ being on the cross, including the statement that he cried from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And we're not going to go into a whole lot of what that means today. There is a lot of essence to that, but we're in John, not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, so we're going to stick with what John has. But I do want to point out that in just the same way that if I were to start the first verses of the Star-Spangled Banner or Amazing Grace, I wouldn't have to go more than 2 or 3 words into that before everybody here would understand what I was singing and would know the words. It would come to your minds because that's kind of what we've been brought up with. We all know the words to Amazing Grace. Maybe not the third and fourth verses, but we know that first stanza completely. And we're overindulged with music and culture and TV and things like that. But the point is that that's something that we know to our hearts. We don't have to think about it. If someone starts off with Amazing Grace, the next words will jump into your mind. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to struggle to remember it. And in the same way, Jewish culture was most of their theology and most of their worship was based on the Psalms. The Psalms were written in such a way that they were music. They were poetry put to words and to music. And it was done in such a way that it was easily remembered, just as our songs are today. A great song isn't necessarily a musically sound um, piece of work as much as it is a catchy beat that you can dance to and you can remember well. The Psalms are all the same way. They were memorable. And so from people steeped in Jewish learning there at the cross, when they heard those words, it was the Romans that mistook that for, oh, he's calling out to Elijah, someone they'd heard about from living with the Jews for a while. The Jews would have understood exactly what was being said here. And as they're looking around at the events that are happening around them, they would have seen the full implications of what is said there. And with that, we'll just read Psalm 22, and I think you'll get what I mean by this. Psalm 22 starts, verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by my people. All those who seek me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. But not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me. The strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs encompass me, company of evildoers encircle me, and they have pierced my hands and my feet. I count all my bones, they stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, for all my clothing they have cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far off. O you, my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. You've rescued me from the horns of wild oxen. I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation, and I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, glorify him, and stand in awe of him, all you offspring of Israel. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him. He has heard when he cried to him. From you come my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will perform for all those who fear him. The afflicted shall eat and be satisfied, and those who seek him shall praise the Lord. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth eat and worship. Before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, even one who could not keep himself alive. Posterity shall serve him, and it will be told of the Lord of the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. Now, I doubt that anybody throughout history before the Romans so deeply impacted the history of the Jewish nations saw the cross coming when they read that psalm. It was in doubt for a long while that was even a messianic prophecy until Christ fulfilled every single word of it. It's interesting to note that was written 400 years before the art of crucifixion was even started, much less perfected by the Romans. And up until that point, there was no form of death in a public scene that included piercing the hands and feet. That was a unique thing to the cross. All the pain and the anguish that is described in that psalm were visited on Jesus. Our word, if you think about the words in the human language that we use to describe pain, what's the one word that's used to describe the most unimaginable pain there is? Excruciating. It's a Latin word. It means from the cross. Our word for the most imaginable pain possible describes crucifixion. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail on that here in a minute. But I wanted to start with that psalm because I want everybody to understand that, not again to dwell on the horror of what we did to God, but on the fact that God did it willingly for us. That this was predicted. This was talked about in the Garden of Eden when God promised that he would send the seed of a woman, which in itself is just a weird statement because women don't have seeds. That's the man's job. But the seed of a woman would come forth and would crush the head of the serpent, even as the serpent bruised his heel. You know, that was the first prediction of the coming of the Messiah. And as Jewish history unfolded, and we have all these great stories and what we call the Old Testament, you know, all these things came about because of God's plan, because of God's providence, because this was the plan. This was always plan A. There was never a plan B. The crucifixion had to occur. We will celebrate next week on Easter Sunday the resurrection. And that should be a far bigger holiday for us than Christmas is. A far bigger holiday than Thanksgiving or Halloween or any of the others combined. Because it is, in truth, the celebration of the day that once and for all, sin, Satan, evil, death were conquered, defeated, crushed. Their powers taken away. We should revel in that. We should rejoice in that. But before we can do that, we have to go through the cross just like he did. The resurrection would have no power if he didn't die first. And his death had to encompass all of the hatred and all of the evil and all of the sins of mankind from beginning to end, dealt on one man's back, one man's shoulders. And that man was Jesus. And that's where we pick up the story today. Again, back in John chapter 18, we ended on halfway through verse 38 last week when Pilate says the words, "What is truth?" And after he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and he told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at Passover. So who do you want me to release to you? The King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Now that word will get translated as brigand, robber, thief, murderer in some translations. It all basically encompasses the idea of who Barabbas was. He was not a good person. I'm not saying he was a bad dad or hateful to his wife or anything like that, but in modern translations, you could translate that terrorist and get away with it. He was a revolutionary. He hated Rome. He was wanting to see the sovereignty of the Jewish nation reestablished. But he was going about it the wrong way. He was not waiting for God to do God's thing. He was doing his own thing, and he was murdering people, and he was causing fear and rabble-rousing, and had been arrested and was sentenced to death. His crimes were such that he deserved crucifixion in the eyes of the Romans without any persuasion from the Jewish people. And here is Pilate trying to find an out, trying to, get out of having to condemn this man who he finds no guilt in to death without suffering from the political ire of the Jewish nation that he's been put in charge of, and therefore being crushed by Caesar himself when he can't control the little small province that he's been put in charge of. So his dilemma is, they're out for blood. He understands that. So in a stroke of genius, he's thinking, okay, they want blood. I have a murderer here. We've already convicted this one of death. So maybe we'll just put it out there. Okay, you want someone to die today? How about this guy? And then we'll let this Jesus fella go. But they say, no, this one must die. And then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Now, here's where we're going to start getting a little bit graphic, because you read through these passages and you read words like crucifixion, and you read words like flogged, and you're thinking, oh, that sounds bad. But it's hard for us to grasp the true horror of what this was. Now, Mel Gibson in his movie The Passion of the Christ did a very, very good job of showing how painful and devastating it was to be flogged. What they used was a weapon called a cat of nine tails. And what a cat of nine tails was a woven whip. The handle was usually about the size of a baseball bat handle, maybe a little bit bigger. It took a very strong man to be able to use one effectively because it was 9 individual leather thongs attached to this handle. And each of those leather thongs was embedded with glass, metal, rocks, stones, teeth from animals, claws, anything they could find that would puncture or pierce or tear human flesh. It was an instrument designed solely for the purpose of destruction. You know, most weapons actually find their roots in some kind of an agricultural form because we weren't always just barbarians out to kill each other. Most of the weapons that we know were originally started as some kind of a farming instrument that then became useful to do other things. Cat of nine tails is one of those weapons that it was never intended for anything other than hurting people. Its entire design was to destroy human flesh. Now, there are recorded incidents of floggings being so bad, and when you were flogged, it was a sentence of 40 lashes minus 1. So 39 lashes is what you were going to get. The reason why it was minus 1 is because most people agreed that 40 would kill you. So they stopped one shy of actually destroying your body so much that you couldn't live. And so it was an instrument of torture. That 40th lash would have actually been a mercy if it did kill you. The kind of agony that you'd be in after being flogged was insane. A cat of nine tails would be whipped at you, and not in the sense of like an Indiana Jones bullwhip where it's just an instant little sting and kind of what we've adopted the idea of spankings and stuff like that for, where it's just a little bit of pain just once and then it kind of goes away. A cat of nine tails was designed so that when it whipped you, it grabbed you, and then they would jerk it back away from you. There are stories about ribs actually being caught by the blades in the cat of nine tails and being ripped out of the human body when they jerked it back. You're chained to a large iron or wood post while they're doing this. You start standing up, but after the first couple of hits, you drop to your knees, or as close to your knees as you can get, because usually you were chained so high enough up that you couldn't actually rest on your knees. So now you're being dangled by your arms as you're being whipped repeatedly by a cat of nine tails. And it's literally tearing the flesh off of your body. It was a gruesome, ugly, horrible thing. So when you read the word flogged, which John mercifully just throws in there just as that word, then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they arrayed him in a purple robe. Now I just want you to imagine for a moment, this was probably not a polyester robe, probably not silk, probably not fine. It was most likely just hard wool dyed purple. You ever had wool and a paper cut? That wool gets in there, it starts to irritate. Now imagine that being put on your back after it's been torn to shreds. Add to that a crown of thorns that they just wove together and shoved down onto your forehead. This is what we did to Jesus. And then they came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they would strike them with their hands. And Pilate went out again to the Jews and said, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." And I want you to understand the ludicrousness of this statement. A lot of times we try to paint Pilate as just this unfortunate figure that had a hard decision to make and he made the wrong one. And we try to supplicate his guilt, even with the words of Christ himself, which we'll cover here shortly. And we try to think of Pilate as just almost an innocent bystander in this, who just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Pilate didn't put an end after the flogging, which he'd ordered. He didn't put an end to the torture that his soldiers did. He didn't stop them from putting the robe on them, didn't stop them from putting the crown of thorns on their head. There's no sign that he rebuked them at all. And then he parades them in front of the Jews who are already calling for his blood and says, "Behold the man." that I find no guilt in. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, Behold the man. And when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him! Crucify him! And Pilate said to them, Take him away yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. And the Jews answered, We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God. And here you have the thrust of their argument. The entirety of their hatred towards Jesus. And in fact, in Mark's gospel, it said that Pilate knew that the reason why they wanted him dead was because of envy and fear. And now Pilate hears this from them for the first time. All so far that Pilate knows about this is that he's done something that the Jews think that deserves death. They've told him that if he hadn't done bad things, we wouldn't bring him to you. But they haven't told him exactly what the crime is, and now it comes out. He claims to be the Son of God. No, grown folks are speaking. And when Pilate hears this statement, he becomes even more afraid. And he entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, Will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you or the authority to crucify you? And Jesus answered him and said, You have no authority over me at all unless it's given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. And that's that statement that I'm saying that we use to justify Pilate's actions and try to make Pilate not such a bad guy. Throw that out. That's crap. Pilate was not a good person. He said himself he had the authority to do this. He had the authority to let him go. He had the authority to crucify him. Christ's statement was not some way to subjugate the guilt that he would feel over condemning him to death. It was simply a statement saying that you don't have any authority over me that I don't give you. It's a statement that we need to learn well as Christians, because that same authority has been given to us. And our enemy, Satan, has no authority over us that we don't give him. Satan does not make you sin. He simply makes it enticing. You can't blame the devil for every bad thing that happens to you or every bad thing that you do. It's not his fault. It's yours. It's your fault too. Kitty. Well, there's an entire YouTube audience of two out there that think I'm talking to my toenails. So.
But they can hear her talking to you.
That was loud. But anyways, I just don't agree with the idea that Pilate should be let off the hook for what he did. Now, I don't think that he shares the same level of guilt as the Jews did, and it's obvious that Christ didn't think so either. But he didn't say you're guiltless. He said your guilt is just not as big. Which also lends a lot of argument to the idea that while all sin is sin in the eyes of God, there are different levels of sin. There are different levels of guilt. And I think, therefore, that there will be different levels of punishment. Just as there will be different levels of reward. I mean, God is a just God. He's a fair God. Well, there's a lot of stories in the Bible, a lot of parables that Jesus told that identify the idea that there will be lessering and greatering degrees of punishment and reward based on how we live, based on what we do. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm sitting here proposing, a jump back to Levitical law and, doing all the things that we're supposed to do and dotting all of our I's and crossing all of our T's and never making a mistake, because that just doesn't work. That's the whole reason Christ had to come in the first place. Because when we adhere ourselves to the law instead of just a relationship with God, we become our own gods. And we start to pride ourselves on our accomplishments, and we start to despise ourselves for our failures, neither one of which God does. God's love for us is eternal. It's everlasting, and that's why Jesus came, was for love. So Pilate was not just an innocent bystander in this. He was not guiltless in this, and he should not be treated as such. But from then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. For everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat him down on the judgment seat in a place called the Stone of Pavement, in the Aramaic Gabbatha. And now it was the day of preparation of the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered them over to them to be crucified. And therein lies the crux, the problem. Here in a moment, we're going to get to the part where Pilate puts a sign on the cross. And in 3 different languages, Greek, Latin, and Aramaic, he writes, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And he didn't do this to honor Jesus, he did this to mock him. Again, just throwing out the idea that Pilate was somehow a good-natured man who just got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Once his mind was set out, he did nothing to ease the pain of Christ, to ease the passing of the suffering. He went full force on it, including taking part in the mockery of God. He was also mocking the Jews. There's this whole diatribe here where he says several different times, "Behold your king. Do you really want me to kill your king? Look at this man, your king. His crown and his purple robe." It was a disgusting display of arrogance and nothing more. In fact, when the Jews say, "Let's not put that on there, let's write, 'This man said he was the king of the Jews," Pilate's response is, "What I've written, I've written." In other words, it's already done. Deal with it. Now, when you take this all together, when you look at the choices being made here, that Pilate originally offered up a choice. Your king, the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God, or the criminal, the rebellious one, the murderer, the thief. And the Jews based their decision on the same thing that Satan based his argument on in the garden the first time. Did God really say? Did God really say, "Don't eat this tree"? Or in this case, did God really say this is his son? Because if the answer comes any differently to them, then history has changed. So if they'd taken choice A and gone with, "Well, God did really say this is his son. We were there at the river when the heavens parted and a dove came down. We saw the power of God and we heard a thunderous voice say, 'Behold, this is my son in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.'" But did God really say? It's the question that plagues all of us. The answer is yes, he did. There is truth in this world. That truth is God, and all truth comes from God. The truth is that Jesus was his son, that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, but we chose darkness instead of the light, and we killed God. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. And there they crucified him with 2 others on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And many Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, 'This man said, I am King of the Jews.' And Pilate answered, 'What I have written, I have written.' And when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless and woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast for lots to see whose it shall be." And this was to fulfill the scripture which says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." And we just read that out of Psalm 22. That's why we started there. Because again, I said John only records a couple of things that Christ says from the cross. And what the other Gospels recorded aren't there. John just adds to the narrative. It's not that he's disputing it. He's just saying, yes, but this also happened. And we can rely on this because, as John himself is about to say here, the person that witnessed this and testifies to this knows it's true because he saw it. He was there for it. And the person he's talking about is himself. John was present at the crucifixion. The other Gospels actually agree on this. John didn't just write himself into the narrative as an afterthought. The other Gospels mentioned him. The other Gospels mentioned other characters being there that John doesn't. And they all either not necessarily dispute each other, differ from each other, but each one of them points out different people. And I think the whole point of that narrative in a beautiful way, and again, just going back to what I've said about all of history pointing to or from the cross, I think the big idea is that at some point in our lives, all of us encounter the cross. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit. The scripture, the Psalm 22, I mean, it just so perfectly described this entire situation. And when you think about how much time had passed between that was written and between this happening, my hands and my feet were pierced. They divided my garments and cast lots for my clothes. And the precise detail that David wrote into that psalm hundreds of years before it happened. And the fact that Christ from the cross cried out those words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And the people that heard that, who knew that psalm, would then look around and see the exact events of that psalm being taken out. Hands, feet pierced, check. Soldiers squabbling over his clothes, check. Casting lots for his outer garments, check. Then someone hears him say, "I thirst." That's also in there. My tongue is dry and sticks to my mouth. That's called thirsty. It's amazing. And it just serves as a reminder that this was not an accidental day. This was planned. This was the plan. This is our redemption, our salvation. It's in a lot of ways the only thing that matters. Christ died for us. He wasn't killed for us. He wasn't murdered for us. He wasn't beaten for us. He willingly laid down his life for us. So the soldiers did these things. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his own home. Now this is a beautiful, beautiful story. I mean, think about what is going on here. And not think about it in some abstract way. Put yourself there. Put yourself at the cross. Think about what's going on. This is Passover. It was the biggest celebration in Jerusalem on a yearly basis. Makes bikes, blues, and barbecues look like some candy-ass gathering. This is huge. Millions of people are flocking to the city, and they're all walking past this spectacle on a hill. They all see it. The biggest day of traveling into Jerusalem would have been this day, as the people that lived in nearby cities and villages that could make the trip in one day and didn't have to plan out weeks in advance to get there come on this day. So they all walk by this man on a cross, the placard that reads, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. They see him bloodied and disfigured, all of his bones out of joint. The piercing of the nails in his hands and feet holding him to the cross. Small crowd of people gathering around while most people just walk on. Some of them ignoring it completely, others taking the time to stop and laugh and mock and spit. People that have no idea who he is or what he's done, just that he must deserve it because look where he is. One of the bigger points of crucifixion was it was a public display of Roman might and authority. Do not cross us. Do not let this happen to you. And that's what you're seeing as you're walking by. But then there's the people that are at the cross. You have the soldiers that are there out of duty. They've been told to be there. They have to do this. This is their job. This is what is expected. Some of them, I think, reveled in it. Some of them, I think, didn't. But they all did their job. You have the high priests and the Pharisees and the council that are there to see what they started finished. They want to make sure it goes down correctly. Most of them didn't stay for the actual death. They just wanted to see him hung there. You have a crowd of women, and all the Gospels denote a different set of women there. I don't think that any one of them is wrong. I just think their lists are incomplete. And for whatever reason, they picked out the ones they did for that reason. All of them agree that Mary Magdalene was there, and all of them agree that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there, and all of them agree that John was there. Some of them simply say disciple. Some of them say followers. Some of them say flock. Some of them say large gatherings. Some of them say several people. But all of them agree that there were actual followers of Christ there at the cross. To see Jesus hanging there like he was, and we are so far removed from the art of crucifixion that it's hard for us to really wrap our minds around what it was. 90% of the time, someone that was crucified died of suffocation. And when you're put to the cross, and we've seen pictures of it, we've seen movie reenactments of it, but I don't think we fully appreciate what is going on during the crucifixion. One, the idea that Christ carried the entire cross all the way is not entirely accurate. He would have just carried the crossbeam. And Simeon, of course, we know from the other Gospels, was conscripted by the Roman soldiers to carry it the rest of the way because the man that they'd just beaten half to death literally hours before couldn't do it. Didn't have the strength to carry the crosspiece all the way. So an innocent bystander was told to do it. And you have to imagine how that changed him. Carrying the crosspiece to the hill where you're about to be crucified was part of the humiliation of crucifixion. It was part of the punishment. You're literally paraded through the streets so that everybody could see what was going to happen. Now, Simeon is carrying this crosspiece and he's done nothing. And I imagine afterwards he did talk and he did ask. And in Luke's gospel, they say that this was Simeon, and they also say that he was the father of Rufus and Malchus. And it seems just kind of an odd detail to throw in there until you run into in the book of Romans when Paul writes about a man named Rufus who's a powerful church leader at the time. And most would argue and agree that they are the same Rufus mentioned as being Simeon's son. He was transformed by carrying that cross. Somehow, some way, one of those disciples found him and talked to him and explained what he'd just done, explained what had just happened. And then later were able to prove it when the Lord was resurrected. Transformed so powerfully that his own son became a powerful leader in the early church. It's an amazing story right there. John doesn't include it, but we're going to throw it in there because I think it is necessary. It is important that we understand. But crucifixion, when they used the nails, and sometimes they didn't, depending on the severity of your crime, a lot of times you were just hung by rope. In the end, the results were the same. It was excruciatingly painful. But the nails were driven into the wrists, done in such a way that it didn't actually touch a bone, just went in between the tendons and the ligaments, so that all of your weight was borne on the 2 points between your hands and your wrists. Your arms were pulled out of socket, so that you couldn't use your chest muscles and your lateral muscles to pull yourself up. You had to depend on the strength of your legs to give you enough support so that you could breathe. So they would drive nails through your feet too, so that when you put the weight on your legs, excruciating agony would come up through your feet, so that you couldn't hold yourself up to breathe for very long before the pain became so overwhelming that you had to sag back down, putting more weight and tension on the nails in your wrists. Add to that the fact that you've been flogged 40 strikes minus 1. And any idea that Christ did not die on that cross but just passed out or just swooned or just did anything other than die is ludicrous. The damage done to his body would be the same as being hit without any kind of protection of your own by a Mack truck going 50 miles an hour and not hitting the brakes before it hits you. John goes on to describe that the priests and Pharisees, and we could read this word for word, but I'm just going to go into it because I'm feeling kind of impassioned right now. That the priests and Pharisees were starting to get a little freaked out because Sabbath was now approaching quickly. It was darkening. It was getting late. So, in not wanting to leave the bodies up there for the Passover, which would break Jewish law, they inscript the soldiers to break the knees of the soldiers, or the knees of those being crucified, so that they die quicker. And again, the idea is that you're supporting yourself to breathe by your feet. Take the knees out, you don't have that option anymore. You suffocate pretty quickly. But when they get to Jesus, he's already dead. And so one of the soldiers pierces his side with a spear to hit the heart, and blood and water gush out, which is also predicted in Scripture. I think the big idea here is that Jesus on that cross, having witnessed all he witnessed, having lived the life he lived, having done the things he'd done, having followed his Father's instructions to the word from the beginning for his entire life, did what he came to do. The exclamation, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's not that he was somehow betrayed by God. It was an expected result of what was happening to him. God cannot be in the presence of sin. He's all holy, all pure. So when his Son became sin, he had to step back and let it happen. It wasn't that God had forsaken Jesus out of spite or out of hatred or out of any kind of meanness. It wasn't because Jesus had actually done something wrong that deserved being forsaken. It was that Jesus had done what he was supposed to do. And the direct result of that was the forsakenness that we deserve as being sinful creatures was visited on him. I submit to you the idea that Jesus did not die from the lashings. He did not die from blood loss. He did not die from suffocation or the pain of the cross. He died from a broken heart. But before he dies, he looks down on his mother, who has suffered herself because of his sake, because of his name, because of his mission. Suffered the humiliation of being pregnant without being married. suffered through 9 months of pregnancy and the actual physical birthing of a child, suffered the guilt of the dozens of deaths that occurred because they were trying to kill her baby, suffered the pain of relocating to Egypt for years to raise him where nobody would try to kill him, nobody would know where he was, suffered the humiliation of going back to their homeland and being mocked and ridiculed for their bastard child, suffered the loss of her husband. Joseph is nowhere to be seen in the later years of the Gospels. Suffered the division of her children who just didn't understand their older brother. Suffered through that child himself one day telling her, "Mom, I've got to be about my Father's business now." And leaving. Suffering through the stories that she's heard. Suffering through the political humiliation and the public humiliation of the things her son was saying and doing. And now suffering the pain that a parent feels when they watch their child suffer. And in his worst hour, in his darkest time, in his most pain, he's compassionate towards her. When he says, "Behold your son," he's not talking about himself. He's not saying, "Mom, look at me, look what they've done." He's pointing to John. Saying, "Mom, it's done. I'm going home. I'm not leaving you comfortless. I'm leaving you John, the disciple I love. He will take care of you now. John, take care of my mom." That's the whole interchange there. The whole idea of, "Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." Saying, "John, she's yours now. You got to take care of her. Joseph's gone. My brothers are going to come around, but they're not here right now. She needs someone now." We talk a lot at the Fringe about this not being religion, but being a relationship. And something I don't think we emphasize enough is that that relationship doesn't start and end with me and God or you and God. It just starts there. Our relationships are supposed to be about each other too. If we forget that, it's easy to fall into sin. It's easy to fall out of fellowship with God. It's easy to look at the events in our life and thinking, "Why me? Why is this happening to me? Why am I alone?" God's saying you were never supposed to be alone. We established that at the beginning. It is not good for man to be alone. We are supposed to have fellowship with God, but we are also supposed to have fellowship with each other. The fact that with his dying breaths, Jesus made that abundantly clear to John. Take care of my mom. Mom, let him take care of you. Thank you. Relationship is not a two-way highway. It's an around-the-world web. It encompasses everything. Just as surely as God encompasses everything, we are supposed to be in a relationship with each other. We cannot forget that. To forget that diminishes the message of the cross. Another gospel records Christ crying out for forgiveness for the people that were doing this to him. "Forgive them, Father, they don't know what they're doing." And I personally like to think that that applies to just about everything I've ever done in my life. I really don't know what I'm doing. Please forgive me. The centurion that strikes Christ in the heart with a spear, not to kill him, but to make sure he's dead. The other Gospels record the natural disasters that happen at that moment. The sun being darkened for 3 hours. Now, our chronological snobbery would say, "Oh, it was just an eclipse. No big deal. We've seen those." Guess what? So had they. Eclipses aren't new to the 20th century. They were a common occurrence. just as common as they are now. And they knew what it meant. And based on the way that all the other Gospels describe it and all the other historians at the time describe it, this was not an eclipse. This was something else. The sun was darkened. If nothing else, it just illustrates the fact that we just killed the light of the world. Hung him on a cross as nonchalantly as we would eat our breakfast. When he died, the earth shook. An earthquake happened. Storm clouds rolled in. Lightning struck. It says that the graves opened and the dead roamed the streets prophesying. You don't see that in a lot of the passion narratives, but it's in the Bible. And when this happens, the centurion that's standing there says, surely this was the Son of God. As I've said earlier today and before, the cross is the centerpiece of history. And the big idea behind that is that one day every single person walking this planet will come face to face with the cross. It is not a matter of when. It is not a matter of if. It is a matter of why. You will be in front of the cross one day. Is it because you're there out of duty, like the soldiers were? Don't think that that doesn't include Christians, the ones that go to church because they think they have to, and they learn their psalms because they think they have to, and they spend their 30 minutes in prayer every day because they have to. They're just doing what's expected of them. They're just doing what they're told. But other than that centurion who came away with a certain first-hand knowledge of who God was and who his son was, the rest of them only came away with scraps of garments. They don't come away with Christ, they come away with what he had. Paltry, bloodied remains of his clothing. I want more than that. Do you come as the passers-by who just want nothing to do with it? They see the spectacle on the hill and they just ignore it and keep going about their merry way? Or the passers-by that see the spectacle on the hill and join in the ridicule, with no understanding of what's actually going on and no understanding of who that man is, just mocking him. Well, he had it coming. What did he do? I don't know. Look at him. On the cross, obviously he had it coming. Are you there like Mary? You're there at the cross because you've suffered for him. Because your love of God said you would. Are you there like Mary Magdalene? There at the cross because the man that's hanging on it has already freed you from your demons, from your sin. You think about the other countless people that had to have been there, the people that aren't mentioned by name. There's kind of been thrown into the idea of a crowd being there. I can think of some obvious choices that would make sense to be there, and some obvious ones that were left out that I don't think were. I don't think Lazarus was there. I don't think that's because he had somehow had a change of heart about his friend Jesus, but I think it was because he knew damn well that they wanted him dead too. They said so. We got to kill this Lazarus guy because Jesus resurrected him, and we got to get rid of that. We can't have that running around, so I don't think Lazarus was there. Mary and Martha may have been. In fact, Mary, Lazarus' sister, might be the other Mary that's mentioned there. What about the woman caught in adultery? What about the nobleman whose child was healed from 20 miles away? What about the lepers that were cleansed? What about the man who had been paralyzed at the pool of Bethesda since birth? What about the man born blind who was given sight? Was he there? Ultimately, it's a rhetorical question because, as I've said, at some point in your life, you will be at the cross. God has designed it that way. All of history goes to the cross. So whether you're there out of respect, out of love, out of fear, out of freedom, out of hope, maybe you're just passing by, ignoring it or ridiculing it, that's your choice. But what you take away from the cross is ultimately dependent on why you're there in the first place. Mary would come away with someone to watch over her while she lived out her remaining years. John would come away with a renewed purpose in life, not just to be taking care of Mary, but to record what he'd seen, to talk about what he'd seen. Later on Pentecost, he'd be filled with the power of the Holy Spirit that would revolutionize the entire world. Where Peter was given the ultimate authority to run the church, John was given the heart to back it. None of the letters in the Bible are as passionate as what John has to say. John was given the special revelation that we call revelation. John was the disciple that Jesus loved. They were best friends. John came away from the cross with something that no one else did. But all this hinges on one other question. Why was Jesus there? He was there for love. He was there to absorb the sins of every man who'd ever lived. To pay the debt owed to an all-holy and eternal God. His last words from the cross, recorded by John, in the English are translated as three of the most beautiful words you could ever hear. It is finished. In the Greek, this word carries several different meanings. It's one word. It was most often used as a banking statement when someone owed a large sum of money to someone else and they make that final payment. It was stamped with a word. I can't remember the word and I left my notes in the office. I'm not going to go get them right now, but what it meant is the debt is paid in full. There is no more obligation for this debt. It's also the word that you would use as a slave approaches his master who's been given a task. You know, whatever that task is, clean the shed, sweep the floors, do the dishes. When it's completed, that was what a slave would say to the master. It is finished. It's done. When Christ used those words, it encompassed so much more. It encompassed everything from the Garden of Eden onward. All of your sins, all of my sins, the ones we've already committed, the ones we still have yet to commit, and we will. All the sins from Cain, through Moses, through David, through all the prophets, all the stories of the Old Testament, all of human history, all the sins that were committed that day against him himself, all the sins that were about to be committed, all the betrayals, all the hurt, all the anguish of mankind were borne on the shoulders of one man who had for 33 years labored for his God, his Father. For 33 years had walked with us, having set aside his glory, having set aside his power, having set aside his throne to be with us, who is taught, who is healed, who has worked endlessly so that we might know who God is. It says, "It is finished." And he gave up his spirit. And at long last, the Lord of the Sabbath was able to rest for a day. Let's pray. Lord, I am overcome right now. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to pray. I don't know what we're supposed to take away from this. I don't know how we live with what we did to you, what we do to you. I don't know how we reconcile our hearts and our souls with the fact that you forgive us for it. I just know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I keep choosing other things over you. I'm sorry that I keep sinning. I'm sorry that I don't know you as well as I should. And we know that what we've done deserves punishment. And that the forgiveness that you give us, the grace that you give us so freely, although it costs us nothing, costs you everything. Well, it breaks my heart to say, oh Lord, I just wish you'd remind us of that. Would you help us remember that, yes, Satan is defeated. Yes, sin is defeated. Yes, death is defeated, but it came at a cost. Our debt is paid, and we owe that now to you. And we thank you that the veil was torn, that we now can come to you, that we can cry out to you, that we are part of your family and part of your heritage, part of your plan. So Lord, we do take our doubts and our shortcomings, our fears, our anger, our sin, our jealousy. We just take all of it, all the darkness in our hearts. We come to you at the cross. We lay it down. We beg your forgiveness. We rest in your love. Till that glorious day that you return and wipe all of these tears from our eyes. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.